The morning I discover my son's true nature, I was standing in my workshop, oil-stained hands carefully rebuilding the transmission of Mrs. Chin's 1998 Honda Accord. At 62 years old, I had spent 4 decades building Harper Automotive from a single bay garage into 3 successful locations across Seattle. Every bolt I turned, every engine I rebuilt, carried the weight of providing for my family and honoring the memory of my late wife, Sarah. The familiar sound of our front door slamming echoed through the house, followed by footsteps I recognized immediately. My son David's arrival always carried a particular energy, urgent and demanding. I set down my wrench and walked toward the house, wiping my hands on the shop rag I'd carried for 20 years. David stood in our living room, his expensive jacket damp from Seattle's perpetual drizzle, designer shoes leaving wet marks on the hardwood floor Sarah and I had installed together 30 years ago. At 28, he possessed the polished appearance of someone who had never known financial struggle, never felt the weight of real responsibility. His hair was perfectly styled, his clothes meticulously chosen, every detail reflecting the comfortable life I had worked tirelessly to provide. "Dad, I need $15,000, he announced without preamble, his voice carrying the expectation of immediate compliance. The investment opportunity one mentioned last week requires additional capital, and the window closes tomorrow. I felt my shoulders tense, a familiar disappointment settling into my chest like cold rain. We had discussed this proposed venture during our previous conversation, a vague business plan involving cryptocurrency and social media marketing that lacked substance or realistic projections. Despite my concerns, David had dismissed my questions with the impatient air of someone who believed experience was irrelevant. "Son, we talked about this," I replied carefully, choosing my words with the diplomacy I had learned through decades of difficult conversations. "You haven't provided a comprehensive business plan, and your track record with previous investments suggests we should approach this more cautiously." David's expression darkened, the practice charm falling away to reveal something harder underneath. "Track record? You mean the ventures you sabotaged by refusing to provide adequate funding? You control every dollar like some dictator, measuring out my allowance like I'm still 12 years old." The accusation stung more than I cared to admit. Since Sarah's death 15 years ago, I had struggled to balance providing for David while teaching him responsibility. Perhaps I had been too controlling, too protective. The guilt of single parenthood had often manifested in financial generosity, attempts to compensate for the mother he had lost, and the emotional support I felt inadequate to provide. "David, I'm not trying to control your life," I said, settling into the leather armchair Sarah had chosen for this very spot. "I'm trying to help you build genuine independence. Real success comes from earning your achievements, not inheriting them." His laugh carried a bitter edge that I had never heard before, cold and calculating in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of his maternal grandfather, a man whose charm had masked profound selfishness. "Independence? You want to know about independence? When you die, I'll finally be free to run the business properly, without your constant interference and outdated methods." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from an extinguished fire. I stared at my son, searching his face for some sign that this was anger speaking, some indication that he didn't truly mean what he had just said. Instead, I saw calculation, a cold assessment of my mortality as it related to his financial prospects. "David," I whispered, my voice catching on his name. But he was already moving toward the door, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood with sharp, final sounds. "Think about what I said, Dad. About the money and about the future." The door closed behind him with controlled precision, leaving me alone in the living room that still held Sarah's presence in every carefully chosen detail. I remained in the chair for a long time, watching the rain pattern against the windows, trying to process the conversation that had just revealed my son as a stranger. Before we continue with this story of family complexity and hard-earned wisdom, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to our channel if you appreciate thoughtful storytelling that honors life experience. Please also share your own insights in the comments. Your wisdom and perspective add tremendous value to our community. Now, let's return to this profound tale of discovery and consequence. That evening, I found myself in Sarah's study, surrounded by photo albums and financial records that told the story of our family's journey. Sarah had been the emotional center of our household, the one who understood people's motivations and helped me navigate the complexities of relationships. Her death from cancer had left me struggling to fulfill both parental roles, often defaulting to financial solutions for emotional problems. I traced my finger along a photograph from David's high school graduation, his smile bright and seemingly genuine as he posed between Sarah and me. Even then, I realized now, there had been something missing in his eyes, a certain emptiness where gratitude and genuine affection should have resided. While his classmates worked summer jobs and learned the value of earned income, David had spent his time in expensive camps and exclusive programs, funded entirely by my growing business success. The financial records painted a stark picture of 28 years of unearned privilege. Private elementary education at $45,000 per year because the public schools weren't prestigious enough for Sarah's son. University of Washington tuition, room, and board totaling over $200,000 for a degree he had barely earned and never used. The BMW I had purchased for his 21st birthday, $38,000 in cash, because he had refused to consider a reliable used vehicle. Each expenditure had seemed reasonable at the time, investments in David's future and expressions of paternal love. Now, reviewing the accumulated evidence, I understood that I had systematically eliminated every opportunity for him to develop character, resilience, and genuine appreciation for the value of work. Sarah would have seen this trajectory clearly. She possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature that complemented my more analytical approach to problems. She would have insisted that David earn his privileges, work for his spending money, face consequences for his failures. Her illness and death had robbed him of that essential guidance, leaving him to navigate adulthood without the moral compass she would have provided. I closed the photo albums and walked to the window overlooking the garden Sarah had cultivated with such care. Her roses still bloomed each spring, tended now by the landscaping service I employed because David had never shown interest in maintaining her legacy. The metaphor was painfully apt, beauty preserved through purchased labor rather than personal investment and love. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. David's voice carried an artificial warmth I had learned to recognize as manipulation, though it had taken me far too long to acknowledge this pattern. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," he began, his tone carefully modulated to suggest reflection and maturity. "I realize I may have been too aggressive about the investment opportunity. Instead of focusing on business, maybe we should focus on our relationship." I waited, experience having taught me that David's most dangerous proposals often began with apparent concessions. "I have a suggestion that could help us reconnect," he continued, his voice gaining enthusiasm that sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "Remember those camping trips we used to take when Mom was alive? The ones up in the Cascades where you taught me about nature and survival." The reference to our shared past caught me off guard. Those camping expeditions had been among our best times together, before David's adolescence and Sarah's illness had complicated our relationship. I remembered teaching him to identify animal tracks, start fires with wet wood, navigate by stars and landmarks. He had seemed genuinely interested then, eager to learn skills that connected him to something larger than immediate gratification. I remember, I said carefully, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "Well, I found this incredible opportunity," David explained, his excitement building in a way that now seemed calculated. "A friend was supposed to join me on a wilderness expedition to Denali National Park in Alaska, but he had to cancel last minute. Everything's already paid for: flights, permits, professional guide services, the whole package. The trip leaves in 3 days, and if we don't use it, everything's wasted. The timeline immediately raised concerns. David had never demonstrated interest in wilderness activities since high school, and the sudden urgency felt manufactured, designed to prevent careful consideration of the proposal. David, when did you develop an interest in Alaskan wilderness camping? I asked, unable to keep skepticism from my voice. Dad, come on, he replied with practiced hurt. You always said that nature reveals a person's true character. Maybe that's exactly what we need right now. A chance to remember who we are together, away from all the complications of money and business. The appeal to our shared history was expertly crafted, touching on memories that still carried emotional weight. Despite my growing suspicions about David's motivations, part of me yearned for the possibility of genuine reconciliation. What if this represented a sincere attempt to rebuild our relationship? What if my cynicism was preventing me from recognizing real growth and maturity? The flights leave March 25th, David pressed. Seattle to Anchorage, then we drive up to the park. 5 days in the wilderness, just like the old times before everything got complicated. I found myself agreeing before I had fully processed the decision. Perhaps desperation for connection with my son override my better judgment, or perhaps some deeper instinct recognized that this confrontation was inevitable and necessary. All right, I heard myself say, let's do it. Really? That's fantastic, Dad. I'll text you all the flight details. This is going to be amazing, you'll see. The line went dead, leaving me holding the phone and wondering whether I had just agreed to healing or something far more dangerous. 3 days later, I stood at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, my worn duffel bag packed with clothing suitable for Alaska's unpredictable March weather. David waited near the departure gate, practically vibrating with nervous energy that seemed excessive for someone excited about father-son bonding. His brand-new outdoor gear still bore store tags, suggesting recent and hurried purchases rather than careful preparation. During the first flight, David maintained constant conversation about wilderness photography and fresh air, consulting his phone more frequently than seemed necessary for someone eager to disconnect from technology. I shared stories from my Navy service, survival techniques learned during training exercises in harsh environments, navigation methods that didn't require electronic devices. You really know all this stuff? David asked, taking notes on airline napkins with what appeared to be genuine interest. 26 years in the service teaches you to be prepared for anything, I replied, noting how his expression seemed to shift slightly, as if my competence represented an unexpected complication rather than a valuable asset. The layover in Anchorage stretched longer than scheduled, providing time to observe David's behavior more carefully. He excused himself repeatedly for extended periods, claiming bathroom breaks, but returning with the flushed appearance of someone who had been making urgent phone calls. When I mentioned noticing his absences, he dismissed my concerns with explanations about checking weather conditions and confirming our ground transportation. The final flight carried us over mountain ranges that stretched endlessly in every direction, peaks that looked like ancient monuments to geological patience. David pressed his face to the window, but his reflection in the glass showed tension rather than wonder, the expression of someone reviewing a complex plan rather than appreciating natural beauty. Anchorage greeted us with crystalline air and the sharp scent of snow, a freshness that immediately reminded me why I had always found Alaska appealing. The rental car process moved efficiently. A Toyota 4Runner with extra insurance and emergency equipment that seemed appropriate for wilderness travel. I handled the paperwork while David loaded our gear, favoring his right shoulder in a way that suggested recent strain or injury. Outdoor supply store next, David announced, consulting his phone with the frequency of someone following external instructions rather than personal preference. Need to grab a few extras before we head to the park. At Northern Exposure Outfitters, David insisted on purchasing specific items that seemed excessive for basic camping, high-powered flashlights, emergency flares, climbing rope, water purification tablets. The clerk, a weathered man whose face bore the scars of decades and harsh conditions, raised an eyebrow at our purchases. Planning to get lost out there? He asked with the dry humor of someone who had seen too many overconfident tourists. Just want to be prepared, David replied quickly, avoiding eye contact with both the clerk and me. The drive to Denali took us through increasingly remote territory, forests that stretched unbroken to the horizon, mountains that dwarfed human ambition. Road signs warned about wildlife crossings and emergency procedures, reminders that we were entering country where human convenience was not guaranteed. Beautiful landscape, I commented, trying to bridge the silence that had settled between us like fog. Yeah, really isolated. David's voice carried a satisfaction that seemed disproportionate to the observation. Miles from anywhere, no cell coverage, completely cut off from civilization. The phrase struck me as oddly specific, more like someone confirming details of a plan than expressing appreciation for natural solitude. I glanced at David's profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force. We stopped for gas at a small station that seemed to serve more as a checkpoint than a convenience store. While I filled the tank, David walked toward the building, ostensibly to purchase drinks and snacks. Through the fluorescent-lit windows, I watched him pull out his phone and make a call, his posture changing to something urgent and secretive, shoulders hunched, voice low and intense. When he returned, I asked casually, "Everything all right? Saw you on the phone." "Just confirming our campsite reservations," he said without meeting my eyes. "Making sure everything's set up properly for tomorrow." The lie came too easily, too smoothly rehearsed. I checked the reservation details myself later that evening, discovering that our permits were for backcountry camping with no designated sites, no confirmations required. David's deception added another layer to my growing unease, though I still hoped my suspicions were unfounded. Denali Lodge appeared around a mountain curve like something from a tourism brochure, rustic log construction nestled among towering evergreens. The facility buzzed with early-season activity, serious outdoorsmen, and experienced guides preparing for expeditions into some of the most challenging wilderness in North America. The desk clerk, a capable-looking woman whose hands showed the calluses of real outdoor work, processed our registration while David studied trail maps with intense concentration. Her questions about our experience level and intended routes revealed the gap between David's ambitious plans and his actual capabilities. "First time to Denali?" she asked, noting our registration information. "For him," I nodded toward David. "I've been to Alaska before, military training exercises." "Which route are you considering?" David stepped forward before I could respond. "Talkeetna River Backcountry Trail. We want the complete wilderness experience, as remote as possible." The clerk's expression shifted to professional concern. "That's very advanced terrain, extremely isolated. Most visitors start with the shorter interpretive trails to assess their comfort level with the environment." "We're experienced campers," David insisted, though his definition of experience apparently included zero actual wilderness camping in recent memory. "My father's practically a survival expert from his military background." I felt uncomfortable with his characterization of my skills and his confidence in an environment that demanded respect regardless of previous experience. Alaska wilderness was fundamentally different from temperate camping, requiring different equipment, techniques, and mindset. The next morning brought our mandatory safety briefing with Park Ranger Jennifer Walsh, a woman whose competence was immediately apparent in her bearing and the respect shown by her colleagues. The briefing room smelled of coffee and pine, walls covered with topographical maps and wildlife photographs that told stories of both beauty and danger. "Gentlemen, let's be completely clear about what you're undertaking," Ranger Walsh began, spreading a detailed map across the conference table. "The Talkeetna River route takes you 35 miles from the nearest ranger station. No cell phone coverage, no other campers this time of year. no emergency services within immediate reach. She pointed to red markers scattered across the map like warning flags. Recent grisly activity here, here, and here. We've documented a sow with cubs in this area, which means an extremely protective mother who will attack if she perceives any threat. Wolf pack sightings have increased, and moose behavior is unpredictable during spring territorial disputes. David leaned forward, studying the isolated sections with fascination that seemed inappropriate for someone concerned about safety. What about emergency evacuation procedures if something goes wrong? Helicopter rescue, weather permitting, Ranger Walsh replied grimly. Could be days if conditions deteriorate. That's why I have to ask about your combined wilderness experience. I answered honestly about my military background and survival training, while David offered vague references to camping with friends and outdoor adventures that sounded suspiciously generic. Sir, with all due respect, Ranger Walsh addressed me directly. This route isn't appropriate for inexperienced wilderness campers. We offer excellent guided tours and shorter trails that would provide challenge without extreme risk. We'll be fine, David interrupted with barely controlled impatience. My father's military training provides all the expertise we need. After signing liability waivers and watching safety videos about bear encounters and wilderness emergency procedures, we rented bear-resistant food containers and emergency beacon devices. I insisted on a defensive rifle rental, a Remington 870 that felt familiar and reassuring in my hands. You sure about the rifle? David asked, his nervousness apparent. Alaska rule number 1, I replied. Never enter bear country unarmed. The wildlife here doesn't care about our good intentions. Our final preparation involved programming GPS coordinates into the emergency beacon, a device that could summon rescue services with our exact location. Ranger Walsh demonstrated the activation sequence with professional precision while emphasizing the limitations of even the most advanced emergency equipment. Push this button, hold for 5 seconds, and search and rescue receives your coordinates, she explained. But remember, in that backcountry location, even with precise coordinates, rescue could require 12 to 18 hours minimum. Loading our gear into the truck, I felt familiar pre-mission tension building in my chest. Every detail suggested careful planning on David's part, but not for the wilderness adventure he claimed to want. The remote location, his obvious inexperience, his insistence on maximum isolation, all pointed towards something other than father-son bonding. Still confident about this route? I asked as we pulled away from the ranger station. David's smile looked forced, more grimace than expression of joy. Absolutely. No turning back now, right, Dad? The phrase resonated strangely, carrying finality rather than enthusiasm. Through the rearview mirror, I watched the ranger station disappear behind forests that suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like trap. The forest road narrowed progressively until branches scraped our windows like skeletal fingers reaching for something they couldn't quite grasp. My GPS showed our position moving steadily away from civilization, past the final cell tower, beyond the last emergency checkpoint, into wilderness that had claimed unprepared travelers before us. We're officially disconnected now, I observed, watching the signal bars disappear from my phone display. Perfect. David's laugh sounded hollow. Just us and nature, exactly what we needed. The trailhead appeared after another hour of increasingly difficult driving, marked by weathered wooden posts that looked like grave markers in the afternoon light. Unloading our backpacks revealed the dramatic difference in our preparation, mine efficiently packed and distributed from decades of military experience. David's bulging awkwardly with gear he had obviously never tested or organized properly. Jesus, this weighs a ton, he complained, struggling with shoulder straps that clearly didn't fit correctly. Proper weight distribution takes practice, I said, adjusting his pack and noting how he winced when I touched his right shoulder. Did you injure yourself recently? Old sports injury. Nothing serious, he replied, but his discomfort seemed fresh rather than chronic. The trail wound through dense spruce forest where afternoon sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that felt both peaceful and ominous. Moss-covered logs created natural obstacles, and small streams required careful navigation across slippery stones worn smooth by countless seasons of snowmelt. Wildlife signs appeared immediately and abundantly. Massive moose tracks pressed deep into muddy sections of trail, claw marks on tree bark that could only have come from bears, eagle cries echoing from somewhere high above the forest canopy. The distant howling that meant wolves, probably several miles away, but close enough to remind us that we were visitors in their territory. "You hear that?" David stopped suddenly, his face paled despite the cool air. "Wolf pack, probably 5 or 6 miles north," I replied, continuing to walk while noting that his nervousness seemed to have little connection to wildlife appreciation. For someone who had insisted on this remote route, he appeared genuinely frightened by its realities. 3 hours of steady hiking brought us to a clearing beside a fast-moving creek, an ideal campsite with level ground, fresh water, and clear sight lines in all directions. Military habits automatically engaged as I surveyed defensive positions and potential escape routes, while David sat heavily on a fallen log and pulled out his water bottle. "How much farther are we planning to go?" he asked, breathing harder than the terrain warranted. "This location works well for tonight," I replied, beginning to establish our campsite with systematic efficiency. "We can push deeper into the backcountry tomorrow if conditions remain favorable." Setting up camp revealed more evidence of David's inexperience with wilderness environments. While I methodically established our perimeter, hanging food caches 12 feet above ground, positioning cooking areas downwind from sleeping quarters, organizing emergency supplies for easy access, David struggled with basic tent assembly. "Dad, can you help with this?" He held up tangled guy lines like surrender flags, his frustration apparent. Teaching him proper technique brought back memories of our earlier camping trips, when he had genuinely wanted to learn instead of simply expecting inheritance. But questions continued to nag at me. Why insist on wilderness camping when you couldn't handle fundamental equipment? Why choose such an isolated location when you clearly felt uncomfortable with basic outdoor challenges? Evening brought temperatures that dropped steadily toward freezing, reminding us that March nights in Alaska demanded serious respect. I prepared a simple but nutritious meal while David sat unusually quiet beside our campfire, staring into the flames with an expression I couldn't interpret. "Remember when we used to do this regularly?" I attempted conversation, hoping to recapture some genuine connection. "You were maybe 10 years old. Always insisted on roasting marshmallows until they caught fire and fell into the coals. Mom was still alive then," David said quietly, his voice carrying unexpected sadness. "She loved our camping trips, so they brought out people's authentic character." I nodded, encouraged by what seemed like genuine emotion and positive memory. "Your mother understood human nature better than anyone I've ever known. She would have guided you through these adult challenges much more effectively than I have." "Tell me about your childhood, Dad," David said suddenly. "Before the military, before the business success, what was it like growing up without money?" The question surprised me. David rarely showed interest in my background or the experiences that had shaped my values and work ethic. I found myself sharing stories I hadn't told in years. Memories of growing up in rural Montana, working farm jobs during summers, earning every dollar through physical labor and determination. "Sounds difficult," David commented, though his tone suggested calculation rather than sympathy. "Hard work builds character," I replied, adding another log to our fire. "It taught me the value of earning what you have, appreciating opportunities, understanding that nothing worthwhile comes without effort and sacrifice." Something flickered across David's features, an expression that might have been resentment or frustration, but when he spoke again, his voice remained carefully neutral. Lucky for me, right? Getting to skip all that character building struggle. The conversation continued around our campfire, David prompting more stories about my military service, survival training, and the skills that had kept me alive in hostile environments. I shared more personal history than usual, encouraged by what appeared to be genuine interest and a desire for deeper understanding. How do you know when someone is lying to you? David asked suddenly, the question seeming to come from nowhere. Body language, voice patterns, inconsistencies in their story. I replied, poking the fire and sending sparks spiraling into the darkness above us. Experience teaches you to read people's motivations and detect deception. Why do you ask? Just curious, he said. You've always been good at understanding people's real intentions. Later, as I prepared to bank the fire for the night, peaceful silence settled over our campsite. Stars emerged in patterns unmarred by city lights, reminding me why I had always found wilderness environments spiritually restorative. The forest sounds created a natural symphony that should have been deeply comforting. I'll take first watch, David volunteered unexpectedly. Not really tired yet. Want to enjoy listening to the night sounds. You sure? I asked, surprised by his offer. We have a full day of hiking tomorrow. Yeah, I want to appreciate this experience, he replied. Listen to the forest. Think about what we've discussed tonight. I entered my tent, trusting my son to wake me for the second shift, though something about his offer felt inconsistent with his previous behavior. Through the nylon walls, I could hear him moving around the fire, adding logs, settling into what should have been a comfortable watch position. As sleep approached, I realized what bothered me about David's sudden interest in solitary reflection. In all our conversations over the years, he had never shown appreciation for quiet contemplation or connection with natural environments. Why would that change now, in the middle of Alaska wilderness? The last sound I noticed before exhaustion overcame my concerns was a change in the movement around our campsite. No more casual activity around the fire, just careful stillness that suggested someone waiting rather than peacefully watching over our camp. Dawn light filtering through my tent walls brought me to consciousness earlier than expected. Outside, I heard the metallic sounds of equipment being systematically loaded, too early and too urgent for normal morning preparations. The sounds carried purposeful efficiency that seemed inconsistent with leisurely wilderness camping. I unzipped the tent entrance and stepped into frigid air that made my breath visible in white clouds. David stood beside our truck, methodically packing every piece of survival equipment we had brought: GPS devices, emergency beacon, rifle, food containers, water purification supplies. Everything disappeared into the vehicle with military precision he had never displayed before. What's happening? My voice cut through the morning silence with more sharpness than I had intended. David startled, then straightened with defiant posture that I had never seen from him before. Getting ready to leave. Change of plans. We scheduled 3 more days of camping, I replied, watching him continue loading equipment with systematic thoroughness. What's the sudden rush? Weather's changing, he said without meeting my eyes. Storm system moving in. Could be dangerous to stay. The lie hung between us like morning mist. Yesterday's weather forecast had predicted clear conditions for the next 4 days, and the sky showed no threatening clouds. Every instinct developed through decades of military service suddenly screamed warnings that I could no longer ignore. David, look at me, I said firmly. Tell me what's really happening here. Something fundamental shifted in his expression. Years of carefully controlled resentment exploding across his features like water bursting through a failed dam. The mask of filial affection fell away completely, revealing something cold and calculating that I had never seen before. You want to know what's happening? His voice carried venom that shocked me with its intensity. I'm done. Done with your control, your manipulation, your constant judgment disguised as paternal wisdom. Son, I don't understand what you're talking about. Don't call me son, he snarled, wheeling around with fists clenched. Sons don't get treated like employees. Sons don't have to beg for every dollar while their father hoards millions and dispenses judgment like some moral authority. The hatred in his voice hit me like physical blows. This wasn't momentary anger or frustration speaking. This was cultivated resentment that had festered beneath our family's surface for years, growing stronger with every interaction, every conversation, every attempt at connection. David, I've given you everything I could. You've given me nothing, he replied, his voice cracking with rage that seemed to have been building for decades. You made me dependent, kept me weak, controlled every aspect of my life with your checkbook and your disapproval. Well, I'm taking control now. Understanding dawned slowly, like sunrise revealing a landscape I had never seen before. This camping trip, you planned this. Finally understanding, are you? His laugh carried no warmth, no humor, just bitter satisfaction. Took you long enough to figure it out. Why? The words scraped my throat raw. If you needed money, we could have worked out arrangements, found solutions. I don't want your allowance anymore, Dad. David's voice dropped to something quiet and deadly. I want what's rightfully mine. Your business, your assets, everything you've been dangling over my head for decades like rewards for good behavior. The morning air seemed to crystallize around us. I stared at this stranger wearing my son's face, speaking words that shattered 28 years of paternal love and sacrifice. You're planning to leave me here, I said, the reality finally penetrating my shock. Very perceptive, he replied with mock applause. Yes, I'm leaving you here to figure things out for yourself. Maybe 35 miles of wilderness will teach you what real dependence feels like. My chest constricted with a pain deeper than physical injury. David, this is bear country. Without equipment, without GPS, without emergency beacon, this is attempted murder. Should have considered that before you turned me into your puppet, he said, slamming the truck's tailgate shut with finality. Maybe you'll survive. Maybe you won't. Either way, I'll inherit what should have been mine years ago. Please, I whispered, the word torn from somewhere deep in my chest. Whatever mistakes I made, we can correct them. Don't do this. For just a moment, something flickered across his features. Doubt, perhaps, or some faint echo of remembered affection. Then his expression hardened into something completely unrecognizable, devoid of any filial emotion or human warmth. Goodbye, Dad, he said, climbing into the driver's seat. Try not to meet the grizzlies too quickly. I want you to have time to think about what you created. The engine roared to life. I stepped toward the truck, desperate to find some way to reach him, to appeal to whatever remained of the son I had raised and loved. But David threw the transmission into reverse and backed away, leaving me standing on empty dirt road in vast Alaskan wilderness. Through the windshield, I saw his face one final time, cold and calculated, showing no trace of regret or uncertainty. The sound of the engine faded gradually into distance, leaving me standing alone 35 miles from the nearest human being, surrounded by silence that felt absolute and final. Dust settled around my feet like grave dirt. The quiet that followed was complete, broken only by wind through spruce trees and the distant cry of a hawk. I remained motionless for several minutes, processing the enormity of what had just occurred. My son had sentenced me to death for money. Military training finally overcame emotional devastation. Decades of Navy discipline asserting control over shock and grief. Survival became the immediate priority. Everything else could be processed later if I lived long enough to reach safety. First assessment, resources. I inventoried my pockets carefully. Wallet, house keys, a small folding knife I had forgotten carrying. No food, no water, no navigation equipment, just the clothing I wore and nothing else that would help me survive Alaska wilderness. Second assessment, environment and threats. March temperatures meant freezing nights, bears emerging from winter dens, unpredictable weather patterns. The terrain consisted of dense forest, unmarked trails, and complete isolation from rescue services. Third assessment, priorities. shelter, water, signaling, navigation, in that order. I studied the sun's position, calculating direction and time. East led deeper into wilderness and certain death. West eventually reached park roads, though at what distance remained unknown. Movement meant survival. Remaining stationary meant death from exposure, predation, or simple dehydration. I began walking west, following faint tire tracks David had left in the soft earth. Within 200 yards, the tracks diverged from what appeared to be a game trail, cutting through underbrush. Animal trails typically led to water sources, essential for survival and potentially visible to rescue aircraft. I chose the game trail, breaking branches as I walked to create markers for potential search teams. The forest enveloped me like a living cathedral, massive trees blocking sunlight and creating perpetual twilight that felt both majestic and threatening. Bear sign appeared everywhere, claw marks on bark, enormous paw prints in mud, fresh scat that reminded me constantly of the dangers surrounding my every step. I made noise while walking, remembering Ranger Walsh's instructions about avoiding surprise encounters with wildlife. The irony was profound. My son had placed me in a situation where bears represented only one of many lethal threats. Hours passed in steady progression through increasingly difficult terrain. My mouth grew dry, then desperately parched. The game trail meandered through dense vegetation, sometimes disappearing completely and forcing me to backtrack and search for continuation. Exhaustion crept into my legs and back, but stopping meant losing precious daylight. At 58 years old, my body was decades past its military peak, and civilian conditioning proved inadequate for this challenge. Then I heard something that changed everything. Mechanical sounds, rhythmic and definitely human-made. Multiple engines moving through forest somewhere north of my position. The sounds grew closer, methodical rather than random, suggesting purposeful travel rather than casual recreation. Hope surged through my chest for the first time since David's betrayal. I changed direction, moving toward the engine noise, pushing through undergrowth that tore at my clothing. The mechanical sounds grew louder, clearly all-terrain vehicles traveling slowly and deliberately. Breaking through the tree line, I stumbled into a clearing where 4 ATV riders had stopped for what appeared to be a rest break. They looked up in shock as I emerged from the forest, disheveled and clearly out of place in remote wilderness. The lead rider, a bearded man who radiated outdoor competence, immediately shut off his engine and approached with professional concern. "Sir, what happened? Why are you out here alone without equipment?" My voice came out hoarse from dehydration and stress. "My son abandoned me here, took all our gear and drove away. Said he wanted me to die so he could inherit my business." The man's expression shifted from concern to disbelief, then to anger. "Someone deliberately abandoned you here? That's attempted murder." "I'm William Harper," I managed. "My son David brought me on what I thought was a camping trip, then left me to die in the wilderness." "I'm Oliver Reed, former park ranger," the bearded man replied, removing his helmet to reveal intelligent eyes that seemed to be rapidly assessing both my condition and my story. "These are my friends. We're doing backcountry touring." The other riders gathered around, their faces showing the horror that experienced outdoorsmen feel when confronting deliberate wilderness abandonment. One of them, a woman in her 30s, handed me a water bottle that I drained gratefully. "How long ago did this happen?" Oliver asked, his tone becoming professionally urgent. "This morning, maybe 5 hours ago." Oliver exchanged glances with his companions, some form of nonverbal communication passing between them. "There's something you should know," he continued, studying his GPS device. "If your son took the main park road, he's looking at a 7-hour drive minimum to reach Anchorage. But I know a shortcut." The implication struck me like electricity. "You mean I could get back before him?" "Easily," Oliver replied. "Old Ranger Trail that cuts through backcountry. We can have you at the park entrance in 90 minutes. Question is, do you want to involve law enforcement immediately? Or do you have other plans?" Something hard crystallized in my chest, replacing desperation and fear with cold determination. David had calculated my death, planned my destruction, counted on my helplessness and his inheritance. He had made one critical error in underestimating both wilderness community solidarity and my survival instincts. I want to get back to the lodge first, I said carefully, before I decide anything about police involvement. Oliver nodded with understanding. Climb on behind me. We'll take the ranger trail. Your son will never know we're coming. The ATV ride through hidden forest paths revealed aspects of Denali I never could have imagined. A network of service trails maintained for emergency access and known only to rangers and serious backcountry guides. Oliver navigated with the confidence of someone who had traveled these routes for decades. I spent 18 years as a ranger here, he explained over engine noise. Seen a lot of poor decisions and dangerous situations, but deliberate abandonment crosses into criminal territory. We emerged onto paved road well ahead of Oliver's estimate, the Denali Lodge appearing in the distance like salvation itself. As we approached the parking area, I scanned for our rental truck. David had not yet returned. Looks like your son's still driving back, Oliver observed. You have time to prepare whatever reception you're planning. The other riders offered contact information, promising to serve as witnesses if legal proceedings became necessary. Oliver handed me his business card with personal contact details inscribed on the back. Call me when you're ready to involve authorities, he said. What your son did needs consequences. As they prepared to leave, Oliver paused with final question. Sir, what are you planning to do when he gets back? I looked toward the lodge room, where our belongings waited, then felt the legal documents still folded in my jacket pocket. Documents I had prepared 3 weeks ago in a moment of frustration, never imagining how prophetic they would prove. I'm going to give him exactly what he wants, I said quietly, just not the way he expects to receive it. Back in our lodge room, I sat on the bed and retrieved my phone. Oliver's card lay beside me along with his offer to contact authorities immediately. But first, I needed to implement plans I had never thought I would actually need. The legal documents felt heavier than paper should, weighted with consequences David could never have anticipated. 3 weeks ago, responding to his increasingly entitled behavior, I had changed my will with clinical precision. Mason would inherit nothing. Everything would go to wildlife conservation organizations, veteran support groups, and scholarship funds established in Sarah's memory. The irony was perfect and terrible. David's attempt to murder me for inheritance would leave him with exactly nothing while supporting causes that represented everything he had rejected: service, sacrifice, and genuine contribution to society. I called my attorney in Seattle, confirming that the new will would be filed officially the next morning regardless of tonight's outcome. David's inheritance had already evaporated, he just didn't know it yet. Next, I contacted the lodge office and arranged for an adjacent room for Oliver, who had agreed to return as witness to whatever confrontation was coming. The desk clerk asked no questions about the unusual request, perhaps accustomed to Alaskan drama. Evening approached with surreal calm. I showered off wilderness grime, changed into clean clothes, and arranged the room methodically. Legal documents spread across the desk where David would see them immediately, my phone programmed with emergency numbers. Every advantage shifted to my favor. Military training had taught me that preparation eliminated variables. Tonight, David would walk into a controlled environment where surprise belonged entirely to me. At 8:47, headlights swept across the parking lot, and I recognized the distinctive sound of our rental truck engine. David had returned from his failed murder attempt, probably rehearsing grief-stricken phone calls to report his father's tragic disappearance in Alaska wilderness. I positioned myself in the chair facing the door, legal documents clearly visible on the desk. Through the connecting wall, I heard Oliver adjusting recording equipment that would document everything about to unfold. David's key scratched the lock twice before catching. When the door opened, He stepped inside with the cautious air of someone expecting to find an empty room and beginning to plan his performance of discovered loss. The overhead light illuminated his face, and I watched recognition hit him like a physical blow that drove all color from his features. Dad, the word came out strangled, disbelieving, as if he were seeing a ghost. Hello, David, I replied calmly. How was your drive back? His face cycled through confusion, shock, and something approaching terror as the implications of my presence began registering. How are you here? How did you get back? Turns out I'm considerably harder to kill than you calculated. David's legs seemed to buckle slightly. He gripped the door frame, eyes darting around the room as if searching for escape routes or explanations that would make sense of an impossible situation. I don't understand, he whispered. I understand perfectly. I kept my voice conversational, almost friendly. You brought me to Alaska to murder me for inheritance. Spent months planning it, researched the most remote location possible, even practiced your grief-stricken son routine for when authorities discover my body. David's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, sweat beading on his forehead despite cool evening air. The careful planning and confident execution had not included contingencies for my survival. The problem with your plan, I continued, standing slowly, is that you underestimated wilderness community solidarity. People here actually help each other survive, instead of abandoning family members to die for money. Look, if this is about the money, we can work something out, he said desperately. It was always about money for you, wasn't it? I walked to the desk and picked up the legal documents. Every conversation, every camping trip, every moment I thought was father-son bonding. You were calculating my net worth and planning my replacement. David's eyes locked onto the papers in my hands with the focus of someone who finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. Want to know something fascinating? I continued. 3 weeks ago, right after our argument, I changed my will. Called it paternal disappointment at the time, but it was actually prophetic preparation. The remaining color drained from his face completely. What do you mean, changed? I mean you inherit nothing. Not the auto shops, not the bank accounts, not the house your mother loved. Everything goes to charity, wildlife conservation, veterans organizations, scholarship funds in Sarah's memory. You can't do that, he said, his voice breaking. I'm your son. You were my son, I replied with quiet finality. This morning you became something else entirely. A man who calculated his father's death for financial gain. David's composure shattered completely. You self-righteous bastard. You created this situation. Your constant control, your manipulation, keeping me dependent while judging every choice I made. There it is, I said, noting how Oliver's recording equipment would capture every word. The real David Harper emerging at last. You want to destroy me? Fine. But remember, you made me into this. Every dollar you controlled, every condition you attached, every way you manipulated my life. This is your creation speaking. I felt strange calm settle over me like morning mist. You're absolutely right about one thing. I did contribute to creating this situation. I enabled your dependence, confused providing with parenting, bought your affection instead of earning your respect. That represents my failure as a father. Then change the will back, he demanded. Fix this mistake. The will was filed yesterday afternoon, I replied, moving toward the door. It's completely legal and irreversible. But you're wrong about one crucial thing, David. I didn't create your willingness to commit murder. That choice belonged entirely to you. Where are you going? His voice cracked with desperation. To call the police. Attempted murder remains a felony, even when it fails. Dad, wait, please. I paused at the threshold, looking back at my son who appeared smaller somehow, diminished by the complete failure of his plan and the reality of consequences he had never considered. Goodbye, David. In a strange way, you've given me exactly what I needed. Absolute clarity about who you really are and who I need to become going forward. The last image I carried from that room was David collapsing into the chair I had vacated staring at legal documents that represented the complete destruction of everything he had tried to gain through my death. Walking toward Oliver's room to begin the process of justice, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction or revenge, but profound sadness for the son I had lost and the father I had failed to be. David would face legal consequences for attempted murder, but the deeper tragedy was a relationship that had died long before this final betrayal. Tomorrow would bring police statements, court proceedings, and media attention that would expose our family's dysfunction to public scrutiny. David would likely spend decades in prison, and I would spend my remaining years learning to live with the knowledge that love, without boundaries, had contributed to creating a monster. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt genuinely free. Free from manipulation disguised as family obligation. Free from enabling behavior disguised as generosity. Free to become the man Sarah would have been proud of, someone who helped others without expecting gratitude or creating dependence. David had brought me to Alaska to die for money. Instead, I had learned to live for purpose, discovered the difference between providing for someone and actually caring about their character development. In trying to destroy me, he had accidentally taught me the most valuable lesson of my adult life. The irony was perfect and perfectly just. Thank you for joining me in this story of survival, dignity, and the complex nature of family relationships. If this resonated with your own life experiences, I invite you to subscribe for more thoughtful narratives that explore the challenges of maintaining respect and boundaries while navigating family dynamics. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every response and truly value the wisdom our community brings to these conversations. Your stories and insights help others who may be facing similar challenges in their own families.